She was just another invisible maid in the mansion, until her dance at the farewell party caught the millionaire's eye and triggered a decision that stunned everyone. Before we begin the story, leave in the comments which city you are watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. You will fire that girl immediately. Eleanor Prescott's voice cut through the conservatory like a blade, her perfectly manicured hand pointing at Grace as if she were something distasteful that needed to be removed. Daniel stepped protectively in front of Grace, his jaw set with a determination his mother had never seen before. "No, Mother. I won't let you fire her." "Excuse me." Eleanor's voice rose to a pitch that could shatter crystal. "That servant has clearly overstepped every boundary of propriety. She's seduced my son into this ridiculous fantasy. The only fantasy here is your belief that love depends on bank statements," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say. "I'm resigning from the company, Mother. I'm walking away from everything if that's what it takes to be with Grace." Eleanor staggered as if he'd physically struck her. "You would throw away a billion-dollar empire for a maid?" Grace watched this exchange with tears streaming down her face, knowing that her secret moment of dancing had triggered a confrontation that would change 3 lives forever. But what she didn't know was that sometimes the most invisible people possess the power to transform everything around them. Have you ever felt completely invisible, like your dreams didn't matter because of where you came from? Tonight, one lonely dance would shatter the barriers between 2 worlds, but the price of that transformation might be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. If you believe love can conquer any obstacle, hit that like button and let's dive into Grace's incredible journey together. 5 years. That's how long Grace Mitchell had been invisible in the Prescott mansion. 5 years of carrying crystal glasses worth more than her mother's monthly medication, of polishing silverware that could feed her family for a year, of moving through rooms like a ghost while the wealthy inhabitants lived their privileged lives. The Prescott estate stretched across 40 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, its Georgian facade imposing against the winter sky like a monument to old money and older traditions. Inside, every room spoke of generational wealth. Persian rugs that cost more than most people's homes, oil paintings of long-dead ancestors in gilded frames, and a crystal chandelier in the main foyer that caught light like captured stars. Grace had learned to navigate this world without disturbing its perfect surface. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, and how to move through the hallways so quietly that the family often forgot she existed. It was a survival skill she'd mastered out of necessity, because in houses like this, the help was meant to be functional, not visible. "Grace, the silver needs polishing for tonight's party," Mrs. Patterson called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed the Prescott household for 30 years. "And mind you don't leave any streaks. Mr. Daniel's friends from the city will be attending." Grace nodded silently, already reaching for the polish and soft cloths. At 26, she'd perfected the art of acknowledgement without engagement, of being helpful without being noticed. Her mother's arthritis had worsened over the years, making her medical bills a constant weight on Grace's shoulders. Every paycheck from the Prescotts went directly to keeping her family afloat. The mansion bustled with preparation for Roberto the chef's farewell party. After 25 years of creating culinary masterpieces for the Prescott family, Roberto was retiring to open a small restaurant with his son in Italy. Tonight's celebration would be held in the main ballroom, a space usually reserved for the most important social events. Grace spent the afternoon transforming the ballroom under Mrs. Patterson's direction. She arranged white roses in crystal vases, each bloom perfect and positioned to catch the light from the massive chandelier. Golden candles were placed strategically around the room, creating warm pools of light that would flatter the wealthy guests. The party began at 8, and Grace retreated to the servants' quarters as the elegant guests arrived. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and the string quartet that had been hired for the occasion. The music drifted through the mansion like a siren call, beautiful and completely out of reach. At 10:30, the sounds from the ballroom began to quiet as guests moved to the dining room for Roberto's farewell dinner. Grace knew the ballroom would be empty for at least an hour while everyone celebrated in the smaller, more intimate dining space. The pull of the music was irresistible. Grace slipped out of her room and made her way through the servants' corridors toward the main house. The ballroom was indeed empty when she reached it, though the candles still flickered and the scent of roses hung heavy in the air. Grace stepped into the room, her heart pounding with the audacity of what she was considering. The golden light transformed everything, making even her simple gray uniform seem somehow elegant. She moved toward the center of the room and closed her eyes. The music wrapped around her like silk, and for the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to remember who she used to be. In high school, before her father left and her mother got sick, she'd been the star of the dance program. Teachers had talked about scholarships, about her natural grace and ability to tell stories through movement. Grace began to move, slowly at first, just swaying with the rhythm. Her arms rose gradually, her body remembering movements she'd practiced 1,000 times in teenage dreams. She spun slowly, her uniform skirt flaring slightly, her face lifted toward the chandelier, as if it were the sun. For these stolen moments, Grace wasn't a maid or a daughter struggling to pay medical bills. She was simply herself, moving through space with the fluid grace that had given her name meaning. She danced with an invisible partner, someone who would see her as she truly was rather than as a function to be performed. What Grace didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Daniel Prescott had excused himself from the dinner to check on some business calls, but instead found himself drawn back to the ballroom. He reached the entrance just as Grace began to dance, and the sight stopped him completely. This wasn't the quiet, invisible maid he'd known for 5 years. This was a woman transformed, moving with such natural beauty and grace that she seemed to glow in the candlelight. Daniel pressed himself against the doorframe, afraid that any movement would break the spell. Grace's face was radiant with joy, her entire being focused on the music and the movement. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or perfect makeup. She was beautiful because she was completely, authentically herself. The next morning brought an unprecedented event. Daniel Prescott made his way down to the servants' quarters. Mrs. Patterson nearly dropped her morning tea when she saw him descending the narrow staircase. "Mr. Daniel," she stammered, "is everything all right?" "I'm looking for Grace," Daniel said simply. Grace was in the laundry room when she heard his voice behind her. "I saw you dancing last night." She turned slowly, her heart hammering. "Mr. Prescott, I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't have been in the ballroom." "You're not in trouble," Daniel said gently. "What I saw last night." "Grace, why didn't you ever tell anyone you could dance like that?" Grace stared at him in confusion. "It doesn't matter. It's not relevant to my work." "Grace, what you were doing last night wasn't just dancing. It was art. It was beautiful." "I used to dance," Grace said quietly. "Before I came here. I studied it in school." "What happened?" "Life happened. My father left, my mother got sick, and dreams became luxuries I couldn't afford." Daniel watched her return to her ironing, seeing the careful way she was avoiding his eyes. "Grace, would you teach me?" "What? Would you teach me to dance?" "The way you were dancing last night." Grace turned to stare at him, certain she'd misheard. "You want me to teach you to dance?" "I know the formal dances, but what you were doing, that was different. That was real." "Mr. Prescott, I couldn't possibly." "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't be appropriate." "I don't care what they think," Daniel said quietly. "Will you teach me?" Grace felt herself wavering. "The conservatory," she heard herself saying. I finish my duties at 9. Then we'll meet at 9:30. Tonight. Grace nodded before her practical mind could stop her. Tonight. That evening, Grace made her way to the conservatory with her heart pounding. She'd changed into her only decent dress, a simple navy blue number that allowed her to move freely. The conservatory was softly lit when she arrived, with candles placed around the room. Daniel had moved the furniture aside, creating an open space in the center. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I said I would. I wasn't sure you'd mean it." Grace looked around the transformed room. "You really want to learn." "I really want to learn," Daniel confirmed. "But more than that, I want to understand. Last night, watching you dance, I realized I've never seen anyone look as free as you did in that moment. It's just movement. It's not magic, isn't it?" Daniel stepped closer. "Grace, I've lived in this house my entire life, surrounded by beautiful things. But I've never seen anything as beautiful as you were last night." Grace's breath caught. "Mr. Prescott." "Daniel," he corrected gently. "If you're going to teach me to dance, you should call me Daniel." Daniel offered her his hand. "Where do we begin?" Grace stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that if she took it, everything would change. She thought about her mother's medical bills, about the safety of her position. Then she thought about the loneliness in Daniel's eyes and the genuine interest in his voice. Grace took his hand. "We begin," she said softly, "with learning to listen to the music." The warmth of his palm against hers sent electricity up her arm. His hand was softer than she'd expected, unmarked by the kind of labor that had roughened her own fingers, but his grip was steady and sure. "Close your eyes," Grace instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel obeyed, and Grace found herself studying his face in the candlelight. Without the armor of his usual composed expression, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "What do you hear?" she asked. "Music," Daniel replied, then caught himself. "Sorry, that was obvious." "No, it's not obvious. Most people hear notes, or rhythm, or melody. But music is more than that. What story is the music telling you?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still closed, their hands still joined. "It sounds lonely," he said finally, "but hopeful, like someone waiting for something good to happen." Grace felt her heart skip. "That's perfect. That's exactly what I hear too." Daniel opened his eyes, and she saw surprise there. "Really? Music is conversation, Daniel. It's trying to tell us something. Dancing is just our way of responding to what we hear. So what do we say back?" Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him. "We say we're listening. We say we understand. We say we're here." She guided his free hand to her waist, her cheeks warming as his fingers settled against the simple fabric of her dress. "Dancing isn't about the steps, though those matter. It's about connection. Feel my breathing." Daniel's hand was warm against her waist, and Grace was acutely aware of how close they were standing. "I can feel it," he said quietly. "Good. When I breathe in, you breathe in. When I move, you move with me, not against me. We're not two people trying to dance together. We're one entity responding to the same music." Grace began to sway gently, and Daniel followed her lead. His movements were tentative at first, careful, but gradually he began to relax into the rhythm. "That's it," Grace encouraged. "Feel how the music wants to move through you. Don't think about your feet. Think about the story we're telling." "What story are we telling?" Daniel asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "We're telling the story of two people finding each other," Grace replied without thinking, then immediately flushed at her own boldness. But Daniel didn't pull away. Instead, his hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I like that story." They moved together in slow circles around the conservatory, Grace guiding him through basic movements that felt anything but basic with the warmth of his body so close to hers. When she lifted her free arm gracefully above their joined hands, Daniel instinctively raised his to mirror her movement. "You're a natural," Grace said, genuinely impressed. I have a good teacher, Daniel replied, his eyes never leaving hers. As the song shifted to something slightly faster, Grace stepped back slightly, creating space between them. Now we try something more challenging. Trust me. I trust you. Grace guided him through a simple turn, her hand leaving his waist to gesture gracefully as she spun under his raised arm. When she turned back to face him, Daniel was smiling with pure delight. That was incredible, he said. How did you make it look so effortless? Practice, Grace said, but she was smiling too. Lots and lots of practice. But you're picking this up remarkably quickly. I'm motivated, Daniel said, and something in his tone made Grace's pulse quicken. They danced for another hour, conversation flowing as naturally as their movements. Grace found herself sharing stories about her dance training, about the teachers who'd believed in her potential, about the dreams she'd had to set aside. Why did you really stop? Daniel asked as they moved through a sequence she'd taught him. I understand about your mother's illness, but surely there were ways to continue dancing while helping your family. Grace was quiet for a moment, their bodies still moving in perfect synchronization. Because dancing made me happy, she said finally. And I couldn't afford to be happy when my mother was suffering. It felt selfish to pursue something that brought me joy when she needed medicine more than I needed dreams. Daniel stopped moving, his hand still holding hers. Grace, that's not selfish. That's not how love works, isn't it? Grace looked up at him, vulnerability clear in her eyes. When someone you love is in pain, how can you focus on anything else? By remembering that your happiness matters too, Daniel said gently. By understanding that taking care of yourself isn't taking away from someone else. That's easy to say when you've never had to choose between dreams and survival. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. You're right. I've never had to make that choice. But watching you dance, Grace, seeing how alive you become when you move, that's not selfish. That's necessary. That's who you are. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I can't afford to be who I am. What if you could? Daniel asked softly. What if there was a way to help your mother and still honor the gift you have? There isn't, Grace said, but her voice lacked conviction. There might be, Daniel said, if you were willing to trust me. Grace studied his face in the candlelight, seeing sincerity there that both thrilled and terrified her. Daniel, whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking that you deserve to dance, he said simply. I'm thinking that you deserve to be seen and appreciated for who you are. I'm thinking that this house has been darker without knowing about the light you carry. You don't understand the world I live in, Grace protested. The bills, the responsibilities, the constant worry about having enough money for next month's medication. Then help me understand, Daniel said. Dance with me every evening. Teach me not just the movements, but the story behind them. Help me see the world through your eyes. Grace looked at him, this man who had everything asking her to share the one thing she'd thought had no value. And what would I get in return? The chance to be yourself, Daniel said without hesitation. The opportunity to dance again. And maybe the possibility that someone sees you as more than just the sum of your circumstances. The music shifted to something slower, more intimate, and without conscious thought, Grace stepped closer to Daniel. They began to move together again, but this felt different from their earlier dancing. This felt like a conversation conducted entirely through touch and movement. Grace, Daniel said softly as they swayed together. I need to tell you something. What? Last night, when I watched you dance alone in the ballroom. That wasn't the first time I've noticed you. Grace's steps faltered slightly. What do you mean? I mean, I've been aware of you for months. The way you move through the house like you're trying not to disturb the air. The way you smile at Mrs. Patterson when you think no one is looking. The way you always volunteer for the most difficult tasks without complaining. You've been watching me? Not watching, Daniel corrected quickly. Noticing. There's a difference. I've been noticing that there's more to you than anyone else sees. Last night just confirmed what I already suspected. Which is, Daniel spun her gently, and when she came back to face him, his expression was serious. That you're extraordinary, Grace. And that I've been a fool for not recognizing it sooner. Grace felt her breath catch. This was dangerous territory, far beyond the safe boundaries she'd maintained for 5 years. Daniel, you don't know what you're saying. Don't I? He pulled her slightly closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Grace, I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who want things from me. Money, connections, status. But you've never asked me for anything. You've never even looked at me like I could give you something you needed. Because you can't, Grace whispered. The things I need, they're not things you can give. What do you need? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible above the soft music. Grace looked up at him, this man who could buy anything in the world, asking her about needs that couldn't be purchased. I need my mother to stop hurting. I need to know that the bills will be paid next month. I need to feel like I matter, like I'm more than just a function to be performed. You matter to me, Daniel said simply. I can't matter to you, Grace replied, even as her heart leaped at his words. We're from different worlds, Daniel. You'll inherit billions of dollars. I can't even afford to replace my work shoes when they wear out. Money isn't the only thing that matters. It's easy to say that when you have it, Grace said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, just sadness. When you don't have it, money is the difference between your mother getting her medication and living in pain. It's the difference between having a roof over your head and sleeping in your car. Daniel was quiet for a moment, their bodies still moving together in perfect harmony despite the difficult conversation. What if I could help with that? He asked finally. Grace stepped back slightly, breaking their close embrace but not letting go of his hands. What do you mean? I mean, what if there was a way to ensure your mother's medical care without you having to sacrifice everything else? What if you could dance and still take care of your family? Daniel, I can't accept charity from you. It wouldn't be charity, Daniel said quickly. It would be compensation. For teaching me to dance, for helping me understand something I've never experienced before. Grace shook her head. You can't pay me to dance with you. That would make this something it's not. Then what is this? Daniel asked, his hands tightening on hers. Because it doesn't feel like dancing lessons anymore. Grace looked into his eyes and saw the same confusion and longing that she felt. I don't know, she admitted. But I know it's dangerous. Why dangerous? Because I could fall in love with you, Grace said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. And that would destroy everything. Daniel's breath caught. Why would it destroy everything? Because you're Daniel Prescott, and I'm the maid, Grace said simply. Because your mother would fire me in an instant if she knew about this. Because people like me don't end up with people like you, not in real life. What if I don't care about any of that? Daniel asked, stepping closer to her again. What if the only thing that matters to me is this? Right here, right now, dancing with you in a room full of candlelight. You'll care tomorrow, Grace said sadly. When you're back in your world of board meetings and society functions, you'll remember that I'm just the help. Grace, look at me. Daniel lifted her chin gently with his finger. I have never in my life felt anything like what I feel when I dance with you. You make me feel alive in a way I never knew was possible. That's not something I'm going to forget tomorrow. Grace stared into his eyes, seeing sincerity there that made her heart ache with possibility and fear in equal measure. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want to keep dancing with you. Every night. I'm saying that I want to know everything about you, your dreams, your fears, your favorite color, what makes you laugh. I'm saying that for the first time in my life, I found something worth fighting for. And I'm saying that fighting for it could cost us both everything, Grace whispered. The music came to an end, leaving them standing in the sudden silence of the conservatory, hands joined, hearts racing, both of them aware that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Grace, Daniel said softly, will you come back tomorrow night? Grace looked at him for a long moment. weighing practicality against possibility, safety against the chance to feel alive again. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll come back." Daniel smiled, and the warmth of it nearly brought Grace to her knees. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me," Grace replied, and realized she meant it in more ways than one. As they extinguished the candles and put the furniture back in place, both of them knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. Grace was no longer just the invisible maid, and Daniel was no longer just the untouchable heir. They were two people who had found something beautiful and dangerous and worth risking everything for. 3 weeks had passed since that first night in the conservatory, and Grace felt like she was living two completely different lives. During the day, she remained the invisible maid, moving through the Prescott mansion with practiced efficiency, dusting priceless antiques, and serving meals to a family that barely acknowledged her presence. But every evening at 9:30, she transformed into someone else entirely. "You're humming again," Mrs. Patterson observed as Grace folded linens in the laundry room. "That's the third time this week I've caught you humming while you work." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "Don't apologize, dear. It's lovely to hear. You seem lighter lately. More like the girl you were when you first came here." Mrs. Patterson studied Grace's face carefully. "Is everything all right at home? Your mother feeling better?" "She's about the same," Grace replied, which was true. Her mother's condition hadn't changed, but Grace's ability to handle the stress had improved dramatically. The evening hours with Daniel had given her something to look forward to, something that made the difficult days bearable. "Well, whatever's put that spring in your step, I'm glad for it," Mrs. Patterson said kindly. "You work too hard, Grace. You deserve a little happiness." If only Mrs. Patterson knew where that happiness was coming from. Grace finished the linens quickly, her pulse already accelerating as she thought about the evening ahead. Daniel had promised to show her something special tonight, though he'd been mysteriously secretive about what it was. At exactly 9:30, Grace slipped into the conservatory to find it transformed once again. Daniel had arranged mirrors along one wall, creating the effect of a proper dance studio. A small sound system sat on a side table, playing soft classical music that filled the space with rich, layered sound. "Do you like it?" Daniel asked, appearing from behind a large fern where he'd been adjusting the lighting. Grace turned in a slow circle, taking in the professional setup. "Daniel, this is incredible. But where did you get all of this?" "I had it delivered this afternoon. Mrs. Patterson thinks I'm setting up a home gym." Daniel's smile was boyish with pride. "I thought you might like to see yourself dance. To see what I see when I watch you move." Grace approached one of the mirrors, studying her reflection in the simple navy dress she'd taken to wearing for their sessions. "I haven't danced in front of mirrors in years." "Why not?" "Because mirrors tell the truth," Grace said softly. "And sometimes the truth is harder to ignore than illusion." Daniel moved to stand behind her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. "What truth are you afraid of seeing?" Grace met his eyes in the mirror. "That I'm not as good as I remember being. That the dreams I gave up weren't worth holding on to anyway." "Grace," Daniel said, placing his hands gently on her shoulders, "you're better than you remember. You're extraordinary. You're biased," Grace replied, but she was smiling. "Maybe, but I'm also right." Daniel turned her to face him directly. "Dance for me. The way you danced in the ballroom that first night. Don't think about technique or perfection. Just dance." Grace looked at him uncertainly. "By myself. I'll watch from here. I want to see you let go completely." Grace moved to the center of the room, feeling suddenly self-conscious under Daniel's focused attention. The music was beautiful, a piece by Debussy that seemed to flow like water, but she found herself frozen, too aware of being observed. "Close your eyes," Daniel suggested gently. "Forget I'm here. Forget the mirrors. Just listen to the music." Grace obeyed, letting her eyelids flutter closed. Gradually, the self-consciousness faded as the music wrapped around her. She began with small movements, just swaying with the rhythm, then gradually let herself expand into the space. Dancing with her eyes closed felt like flying. Grace moved across the floor with fluid grace, her arms creating beautiful lines, her body telling the story the music whispered. She spun and leaped and reached toward the ceiling as if she could touch the stars. When the piece ended, Grace opened her eyes to find Daniel staring at her with an expression of such wonder that it took her breath away. That was, Daniel started, then seemed to lose his words. What? That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Daniel. No, I'm serious. Daniel crossed to her, taking her hands in his. Grace, you have a gift. A real, genuine gift. It's criminal that you're not dancing professionally. Professional dancers need training I can't afford and connections I don't have, Grace said practically, though his words warmed her more than she cared to admit. What if I could help with that? Grace pulled her hands away, taking a step back. We've talked about this. I can't accept help from you. Why not? Because it would change everything between us. It would make me dependent on you, and that would ruin whatever this is. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her face. What do you think this is, Grace? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Grace looked at this man who had everything, asking her to define something that defied definition. I think, Grace said carefully, that we're two people from different worlds who found something beautiful together. But I also think that beautiful things can be fragile, especially when they exist outside the boundaries of what's considered acceptable. Are you saying this isn't acceptable? I'm saying that you're the heir to a fortune and I'm your family's maid. I'm saying that your mother would fire me instantly if she knew about these evenings. I'm saying that society has rules about people like us, even if we wish those rules didn't exist. Daniel moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the determination in his dark eyes. And I'm saying that I don't care about any of those things. I care about you. You think you care about me, Grace corrected gently. But you don't really know me. You know the version of me that exists in this room, dancing in candlelight. You don't know the version that worries about money every day, that lies awake at night wondering if her mother's pain is getting worse. Then tell me about that version, Daniel said immediately. Help me understand all of who you are. Grace looked at him, this privileged man asking to understand struggles he'd never faced. Why? Because I want to know everything about you. Your fears, your dreams, your worst day, your favorite memory. I want to understand what makes you laugh and what keeps you awake at night. That's a lot to ask of someone, Grace said softly. It's everything to ask of someone, Daniel agreed. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Grace, and I want to do it with my eyes wide open. The words hit Grace like lightning. She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Daniel, you can't say things like that. Why not? Because I might start to believe them. Good, Daniel said, stepping even closer. Because I want you to believe them. I want you to believe that someone sees you as more than your circumstances. I want you to believe that you deserve to be loved completely, exactly as you are. Grace felt tears start to fall. And I want you to understand that loving me would be the most complicated thing you've ever done. I come with baggage and responsibilities and a life that's nothing like yours. I don't care about complicated, Daniel said, reaching up to gently brush away her tears. I care about real. And this, whatever this is between us, is the most real thing I've ever experienced. Grace looked into his eyes and saw sincerity there that made her chest ache with possibility. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want to try. I want to see if we can build something together that's stronger than the obstacles we'll face. And if we can't? If the differences between our worlds are too big to bridge, then at least we'll know we tried, Daniel said simply. At least we'll have given love a chance instead of walking away because it seemed too difficult. Grace studied his face, seeing hope and determination and something that looked like love. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. Dance with me, she said suddenly. What? Dance with me? Right now? Show me that you mean what you're saying. Daniel smiled and moved to change the music, selecting something slow and romantic. When he turned back to Grace, his expression was tender. May I have this dance? He asked formally, offering his hand with a small bow. Grace curtsied playfully. You may. They came together in the center of the room, and Grace felt the now familiar electricity of his touch. But this time was different. This time they weren't teacher and student, or employer's son and servant. They were simply Grace and Daniel, two people trying to find their way to each other across the space between their worlds. Tell me about your worst day, Daniel said softly as they swayed together. Grace looked up at him in surprise. My worst day? You said I don't know the version of you that worries about money. Help me understand. Grace was quiet for a moment, remembering. Last year, my mother fell in the bathroom. I came home from work to find her on the floor, unable to get up because the pain in her joints was so severe. Daniel's hand tightened on her waist. What did you do? I called an ambulance, rode with her to the hospital, and spent the night in the emergency room while they ran tests to make sure she hadn't broken anything. Grace's voice was steady, but Daniel could see the memory was painful. The bill for that night was more than I make in 3 months. How did you pay it? I haven't completely. I pay what I can each month, but it's going to take years to clear the debt. And that's if nothing else happens, if she doesn't have another fall, or need more tests, or require surgery. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing the reality of her life. That must be terrifying. It is. Every day I wake up knowing that one emergency could bankrupt us, that despite working as hard as I can, it might not be enough. Grace, I had no idea. How could you? Grace asked, not unkindly. You've never had to choose between paying for medicine and paying for groceries. You've never had to decide which bills to pay late because you can't cover them all. They continued dancing as Grace shared more about her life. The constant calculations, the careful budgeting, the way she'd learned to find free entertainment and stretch every dollar. Daniel listened without trying to fix or solve, just absorbing the reality of a life so different from his own. Now tell me about your worst day, Grace said when she'd finished. Daniel considered the question seriously. The day I realized I didn't want any part of the life that had been planned for me. What do you mean? I was 25, sitting in a board meeting discussing a corporate acquisition that would put hundreds of people out of work. Everyone around the table was excited about the profit margins, and I suddenly understood that this was my future. Making decisions that affected people's lives based solely on numbers on a spreadsheet. What did you do? Nothing. That was the worst part. I sat there and said nothing because I knew my objections wouldn't matter. The decision had already been made. I was just there to learn how to be the kind of person who could make those decisions without losing sleep. Grace felt a new understanding of Daniel settling over her. You feel trapped too. In a different way than you, but yes. You're trapped by lack of money. I'm trapped by too much of it. You can't pursue your dreams because of financial obligations. I can't pursue mine because of financial expectations. What are your dreams? Grace asked softly. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I want to do something that matters. I want to use the advantages I've been given to help people instead of just accumulating more wealth. I want to wake up every day knowing that my life has purpose beyond maintaining the family fortune. And dancing with me? Where does that fit into your dreams? Daniel stopped moving and looked down at her seriously. Dancing with you made me remember that I'm capable of feeling something real. It made me remember that there's more to life than obligation and expectation. Grace felt her heart skip. Daniel, I know it sounds dramatic, but you've changed everything for me, Grace. These past 3 weeks have been the happiest of my adult life. They've been the happiest of mine too, Grace admitted quietly. Daniel's face lit up. Really? But happiness and practicality aren't the same thing. What we have here, in this room, is beautiful. But what happens when we step outside these walls? We figure it out together, Daniel said with more confidence than he felt. Your mother will never accept me. My mother doesn't get to choose who I love. Love, Grace repeated softly, testing the word. Love, Daniel confirmed. Because that's what this is, isn't it? What we feel for each other. Grace looked into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there. The wonder, the fear, the overwhelming sense that she'd found something she'd been searching for without knowing she was looking. Yes, she whispered. It's love. Daniel's smile was radiant as he spun her around the room, both of them laughing with the joy of finally naming what had been growing between them. When he set her back down, his expression grew serious again. Grace, I want to ask you something, and I need you to really consider it before you answer. What? I want to tell people about us. Not everyone. Not yet. But I want to stop hiding what we mean to each other. Grace's smile faded. Daniel, we can't. Hear me out, Daniel said quickly. I'm not talking about announcing it to my mother or holding hands in front of the staff. I'm talking about being honest with ourselves about what this relationship is and where we want it to go. Where do you want it to go? Everywhere, Daniel said simply. I want a future with you, Grace. I want to introduce you to my friends as the woman I love. I want to take you to dinner at restaurants where we don't have to worry about being seen. I want to dance with you in places other than this conservatory. Grace felt panic rising in her chest. That's impossible. Is it? Or is it just difficult? There's no difference when you're talking about our situations. There is a difference, Daniel insisted. Impossible means it can never happen under any circumstances. Difficult means it requires courage and planning and probably some sacrifice, but it can happen if we want it badly enough. Grace pulled away from him, moving to the window that looked out over the moonlit gardens. What you're talking about would require me to give up my job, which means giving up the income my mother depends on for her medical care. What if there were other options? Grace turned to face him. What kind of other options? Daniel took a deep breath, knowing he was about to propose something that could either bring them closer together or drive them apart completely. What if I hired you for something else? Something that would pay better than housekeeping and utilize your actual talents. Doing what? Teaching dance. To me, initially, but eventually to others. I've been thinking about this, Grace. There are programs for underprivileged children who need access to arts education. Therapeutic dance programs for people recovering from injuries. Corporate wellness programs that include movement and stress relief. Grace stared at him. You want to start a dance program? I want to start something that matters. Something that helps people. And I want to do it with you, if you're willing. Daniel, that's a completely different kind of life than what you've been raised for. I know. That's part of what makes it appealing. Grace moved back to him, studying his face carefully. You're serious about this. I'm serious about you. About us. About building something together that we can both be proud of. It would be incredibly risky. Yes, it would. For both of us. Your family would be furious. Probably. At least initially. We could fail completely. We could also succeed beyond our wildest dreams. Grace looked at this man who was offering to turn his life upside down for the possibility of building something with her. Why would you take a risk like that? Because I've spent 32 years living the life other people planned for me, Daniel said simply. And I've spent 3 weeks living the life I choose for myself, and there's no comparison. Because I love you, and I want to see what we can create together when we're not hiding in shadowy corners. Grace felt tears start again. But this time they were tears of possibility rather than fear. If we did this, if we tried to build something together, it would change everything. Everything, Daniel agreed. Are you ready for that kind of change? Grace thought about her small room in the servants' quarters, about the years of invisible servitude, about the dreams she'd locked away because they seemed impossible. Then she thought about the way she felt when she danced with Daniel, alive and seen and valued for who she truly was. I'm terrified, she admitted. So am I, Daniel said. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been if we'd been brave enough to try. Grace looked at him for a long moment, seeing love and hope and determination in his eyes. "What would we do first?" Daniel's face lit up with joy and relief. "First, we research programs and funding. We develop a business plan. We figure out the practical details of how to make this work financially. And second, we tell the people who matter most to us what we're planning. Your mother, Mrs. Patterson, eventually my family. Your mother is going to hate me. My mother is going to have to adjust her expectations," Daniel said firmly. "Because I'm not giving you up, Grace. Not for her approval, not for social convention, not for anything." Grace felt a smile tugging at her lips despite her fears. "You realize we're probably completely insane for even considering this." "Probably," Daniel agreed cheerfully. "The best love stories usually involve a little insanity. Are you team take the risk or team stay safe? Let me know in the comments, because Grace and Daniel are about to discover that love sometimes requires the courage to leap into the unknown." That night, after Grace returned to her room, she lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything Daniel had proposed. Part of her was thrilled by the possibility of a future where she could dance and be with the man she loved. But a larger part was terrified by the magnitude of the changes such a future would require. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Eleanor Prescott returned early from her trip to New York, her sharp eyes immediately noting the small changes around the house that indicated something was different. "Mrs. Patterson," Eleanor called as she swept into the main hall, her designer coat still draped over her shoulders. "Has everything been running smoothly in my absence?" "Yes, Mrs. Prescott. No problems at all." "And Daniel? Has he been keeping to his usual routines?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated for just a moment, but it was enough for Eleanor's keen instincts to pick up. "He's been working in the evenings, ma'am. Quite dedicated to his projects." "What sort of projects?" "I'm not certain of the details. He's been using the conservatory for some sort of exercise program, I believe." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "Exercise program?" "He had some equipment delivered. Mirrors and such. He said he was setting up a home gym." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, already planning to investigate this development. Her son had never shown interest in physical fitness beyond the tennis and sailing required for social purposes. That evening, Grace made her way to the conservatory as usual, unaware that Eleanor was watching from the shadows of the main hall. She'd positioned herself strategically to observe who might be joining Daniel for his mysterious evening activities. When Grace slipped into the conservatory and the sound of music began, Eleanor felt her blood pressure spike. A servant, entering her son's private space after hours, without supervision or apparent purpose. It was completely inappropriate. Eleanor crept closer to the conservatory, positioning herself where she could observe through the glass doors without being seen. What she witnessed made her gasp audibly. Her son was dancing. Not the formal ballroom dancing she'd insisted he learn for social events, but something far more intimate and passionate. And he was dancing with the maid, who moved with a grace and beauty that was undeniably professional in quality. Eleanor watched in horrified fascination as Daniel and Grace moved together with the kind of connection that spoke of hours of practice, of growing intimacy, of something far beyond a simple employee-employer relationship. When Daniel lifted Grace in a graceful turn, both of them laughing with pure joy, Eleanor felt her carefully controlled world begin to tilt off its axis. Her son was having an affair with the help. Eleanor backed away from the conservatory, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd discovered. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a casual flirtation. The level of skill they displayed together, the obvious comfort and intimacy between them, suggested a relationship that had been developing for some time. She returned to her room and poured herself a large brandy, trying to process the magnitude of the scandal that was apparently unfolding under her own roof. Eleanor Prescott had not built her social position by ignoring problems or hoping they would resolve themselves. Decisive action was required, and it was required immediately. The next morning, Eleanor summoned Mrs. Patterson to her private study. "I need to discuss Grace Mitchell's employment with you." Mrs. Patterson's protective instincts immediately flared. "Is there a problem with her work, ma'am? Because I can assure you, Grace is one of the most reliable and skilled members of our staff." "I'm sure she is skilled," Eleanor said dryly. "The question is what skills she's been utilizing in this household." "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't understand." Eleanor studied Mrs. Patterson's face carefully, trying to determine how much the older woman knew about her son's inappropriate relationship. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Grace's behavior recently? Any changes in her demeanor or her interaction with family members?" Mrs. Patterson's face remained carefully neutral. "Grace has seemed happier lately, if that's what you mean. She's been humming while she works, which is lovely to hear." "And has she had any unusual interactions with Daniel?" Mrs. Patterson's heart sank. She'd suspected that Grace's improved mood might be connected to Daniel's sudden interest in spending evenings at home, but she'd hoped their relationship would remain unnoticed until they could navigate their feelings more carefully. "They've both been more present in the house during the evenings," Mrs. Patterson said carefully. "Mr. Daniel's been working on his projects, and Grace has been completing her duties." "Yes, his projects," Eleanor said with a thin smile. "Tell me, Mrs. Patterson, what do you know about Daniel's evening activities in the conservatory?" Mrs. Patterson's silence was answer enough. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, satisfied that her suspicions were confirmed. "I see. And how long has this situation been developing?" "Mrs. Prescott, I think there may be some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Eleanor interrupted sharply. "I saw them together last night, dancing, with a level of intimacy that was completely inappropriate for their respective positions in this household." Mrs. Patterson felt her protective instincts surge. "Grace is a good girl, ma'am. She's worked hard for this family for 5 years without a single complaint. Her mother is ill and depends on Grace's income for medical care. Whatever you think you saw." "What I saw was my son compromising himself with a servant," Eleanor said coldly. "What I saw was a young woman who has clearly overstepped every boundary of appropriate behavior. And what do you intend to do about it?" Eleanor's smile was sharp as glass. "I intend to remind both of them exactly what their positions are in this household. And I intend to ensure that this situation is resolved quickly and permanently." That evening, Eleanor positioned herself in the hallway outside the conservatory, waiting for Grace to arrive for what would be her final dancing session with Daniel. When Grace appeared at precisely 9:30, Eleanor stepped out of the shadows like an avenging angel. "Going somewhere, Grace?" Eleanor's voice was deadly quiet. Grace froze, her heart hammering as she saw Eleanor Prescott standing between her and the conservatory door. "Mrs. Prescott, I thought you were in New York." "I returned early. Fortunate timing, it seems." Grace's mouth went dry. "Is there something you need, ma'am?" Eleanor's smile was arctic. "What I need is to speak with you and my son about the inappropriate relationship you've been conducting in my home." Before Grace could respond, Eleanor pushed open the conservatory door with enough force that it slammed against the wall. Daniel, who had been adjusting the music, spun around in surprise. "Mother, I thought you weren't returning until tomorrow." "Clearly," Eleanor said, stepping into the room with Grace reluctantly following. "Otherwise you might have been more discreet about your evening entertainments." Daniel's face went pale as he realized what had happened. "Mother, I can explain." "Oh, I think the situation is quite clear," Eleanor said, her voice rising with each word. "My son has been conducting a sordid affair with a servant in my own home, using our family space for his romantic escapades with a woman so far beneath his station that the very idea is laughable." "It's not sordid," Daniel said, stepping protectively in front of Grace. "And it's not an affair. Grace and you nothing," Eleanor snapped. "Grace is a maid," Daniel. She cleans toilets and washes dishes for a living. She comes from nothing. She is nothing, and she will always be nothing. Grace felt the words hit her like physical blows, but she forced herself to stand straight, to maintain her dignity in the face of Eleanor's attack. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You don't get to speak about Grace that way." "I'll speak about her any way I choose," Eleanor replied. "She's my employee, and she's obviously taken advantage of her position to seduce my naive son into this ridiculous fantasy." "She didn't seduce anyone," Daniel shot back. "I pursued her. I asked her to teach me to dance, and I fell in love with her." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Love? Daniel, you've confused lust with love, which is understandable given your limited experience with women of Grace's caliber. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that women like Grace understand how to use their assets to improve their circumstances. It means she saw an opportunity to trade her body for financial security, and she took it." Grace finally found her voice. "That's not true." Eleanor turned to her with contempt. "Isn't it? You've been working here for 5 years, barely scraping by, watching my son live a life of luxury while you empty his wastebaskets. Are you really going to pretend that his sudden interest in you isn't convenient?" "I never asked him for anything," Grace said quietly. "You didn't have to ask. Your very presence here, your circumstances, your obvious desperation, it all asks for him." Poor little maid with the sick mother and the medical bills, dancing around in her pathetic dress, hoping the rich man will notice her. "Mother, stop," Daniel said, his voice shaking with anger. "Why should I stop? Someone needs to speak the truth here. This girl has manipulated you into believing you have feelings for her when what you actually have is sympathy mixed with physical attraction. It's not love, Daniel. It's charity with benefits." Grace felt tears start to fall, but her voice remained steady. "I love your son, Mrs. Prescott. Not his money, not his status. I love him." "How convenient," Eleanor sneered. "And I suppose it's pure coincidence that the man you love happens to be worth billions of dollars." "I fell in love with him before I knew who he really was as a person," Grace said. "I fell in love with his kindness, his intelligence, his ability to see past the surface of things." "How touching. And what exactly do you think love is going to accomplish? Do you think you can waltz into society on my son's arm and be accepted? Do you think the women in our circle will embrace you as an equal?" "I don't care about society," Grace said honestly. "I care about Daniel." "Well, Daniel cares about more than just you," Eleanor said, turning back to her son. "Don't you, Daniel? You care about your responsibilities to this family, to the business your grandfather built, to the legacy you're supposed to inherit and maintain." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Grace felt her heart sink as she saw doubt creep into his expression. "Of course I care about those things," Daniel said finally. "But I also care about being happy. I care about building a life that has meaning beyond just maintaining wealth. And you think this girl can give you that meaning?" Eleanor gestured dismissively at Grace. "What can she offer you that you can't find with a woman of your own class? A woman with education, breeding, social connections that could benefit your career?" "She can offer me honesty," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "She can offer me a relationship based on who I am rather than what I have. She can offer me the chance to be a better man than I've been." Eleanor's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Is that what you think? That this servant makes you a better man?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "She makes me want to use my advantages to help people instead of just accumulating more wealth for myself." "How noble," Eleanor said sarcastically. "And when you've given away your inheritance to help people, what then? When you're living in some middle-class neighborhood, struggling to pay bills like everyone else, do you think your love will be enough?" "Yes," Daniel said, but Grace could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Eleanor heard it too, and pressed her advantage. "Daniel, you've been privileged your entire life. You have no idea what real financial stress feels like, what it's like to worry about paying rent or affording medical care or putting food on the table. You think love conquers all because you've never had to test that theory. She turned back to Grace. But you have, haven't you? You know exactly what it's like to choose between dreams and survival. So tell me, Grace, when Daniel's noble intentions meet real-world poverty, when your sick mother needs medicine you can't afford and your utilities are getting shut off, will love be enough then? Grace felt the weight of Eleanor's words, the terrible practicality of the scenario she was describing. Love should be enough, she said quietly. Should be isn't the same as is, Eleanor replied triumphantly. You know I'm right. You know that noble intentions and romantic feelings don't pay medical bills or put food on the table. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace looked at Daniel and saw her own fears reflected in his eyes. They had been so caught up in the beauty of their connection that they hadn't fully considered the practical realities of bridging their different worlds. Here's what's going to happen, Eleanor announced, taking control of the moment. Grace, you will resign your position immediately. I'll provide a reference for domestic work elsewhere, but you will leave this house and never contact my son again. Mother, you can't. Daniel started. And Daniel, Eleanor continued, you will return to your responsibilities to this family and this business. You'll court appropriate women from appropriate families, and you'll stop this ridiculous fantasy about throwing away everything your family has built. What if I refuse? Daniel asked quietly. Eleanor's smile was sharp. Then I'll have Grace arrested for theft. Grace gasped. Theft? There are several items missing from the house. Expensive items. It wouldn't be difficult to plant evidence in your room, to create a story about a servant who took advantage of her access to steal from her employers. You wouldn't, Daniel breathed. Try me, Eleanor said coldly. I will not allow this family's reputation to be destroyed by my son's infatuation with the help. Grace felt the trap closing around them, the impossible choice Eleanor was forcing them to make. You're saying I can either leave voluntarily or be arrested for crimes I didn't commit? I'm saying that one way or another, this relationship ends tonight, Eleanor confirmed. The only question is whether it ends with your dignity intact or in handcuffs. Daniel looked between his mother and Grace, seeing the ruthless calculation in Eleanor's eyes and the defeat growing in Grace's. There has to be another way. There is, Eleanor said. You choose your family and your responsibilities over this fantasy. And if I don't, Eleanor's voice was deadly quiet. Then you lose everything, Daniel. Your inheritance, your position in the company, your place in this family. And Grace loses her freedom when she's convicted of theft. The ultimatum hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything it touched. Grace looked at Daniel and saw him struggling with an impossible choice, and she knew she couldn't let him sacrifice everything for her. I'll go, Grace said quietly. Grace, no, Daniel protested, reaching for her. I'll go, Grace repeated, stepping away from his outstretched hand. She's right about some things, Daniel. We were living in a fantasy, thinking love could overcome every obstacle. That's not true. It is true, Grace said, tears streaming down her face now. I love you enough to want you to have the life you were meant to live. And that life doesn't include watching everything you've been given be destroyed because of me. Grace looked at Eleanor one final time. I'll be gone by morning. She walked toward the conservatory door, but Daniel caught her arm. Grace, please. We can figure this out. We can find another way. Grace looked up at him, memorizing his face for what she was certain would be the last time. There is no other way, Daniel. Your mother has made sure of that. I love you, Daniel said desperately. I love you too, Grace replied. That's why I'm leaving. And with that, Grace Mitchell walked out of the conservatory, out of the Prescott mansion, and out of Daniel Prescott's life, believing she would never see him again. But sometimes love is stronger than the people who try to destroy it. Sometimes the most powerful choice you can make is the one that appears to be surrender. And sometimes, when you love someone enough to let them go, that's exactly when they discover they can't live without you. Grace is about to make a choice that will change her life forever. Are you team take the risk or team stay safe? Let me know in the comments, because what happens next will surprise everyone, including Eleanor Prescott. Daniel stood in the conservatory for a long moment after Grace disappeared, staring at the door she'd walked through as if he could will her to return. The silence felt crushing, broken only by the soft classical music still playing from the sound system he'd so carefully arranged for their evening together. "Well," Eleanor said briskly, smoothing her skirt as if she'd just concluded a routine business meeting rather than destroyed two people's hearts. "I'm glad that unpleasantness is resolved. You can have this equipment removed tomorrow." Daniel turned to look at his mother, and Eleanor took an involuntary step back at the expression on his face. She'd seen him angry before, disappointed, even defiant. But she'd never seen him look at her with the cold calculation that now filled his dark eyes. "Resolved?" Daniel's voice was dangerously quiet. "You think this is resolved?" "Of course it is. The girl is leaving, you're returning to your responsibilities, and we can pretend this unfortunate episode never happened." "No, Mother. We can't." Eleanor frowned at his tone. "Daniel, I understand you're upset, but you'll see that I've done you a favor. In a few months, you'll realize that this infatuation was just." "Stop." Daniel's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Stop talking about Grace like she was some temporary distraction. Stop pretending you know what's best for my life. And stop assuming that threatening the woman I love will make me fall in line with your plans. Daniel, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," Daniel replied, walking to the sound system and turning off the music. The sudden silence was profound. "I'm being reasonable about what matters most to me. And what matters most is not this house, or the family business, or maintaining appearances for society." Eleanor felt a chill of unease. "What are you saying?" Daniel turned to face her directly. "I'm saying that you've forced me to make a choice, and I choose Grace." "She's already gone, Daniel. She left. She chose to preserve her dignity rather than fight for you. She chose to protect me from your threats," Daniel corrected. "She chose to sacrifice her own happiness to keep me from losing everything. But here's what Grace doesn't understand about me, Mother. Here's what you've never understood either." "What?" Daniel walked to the window that looked out over the moonlit gardens, the same view he'd watched countless times while growing up in this house. "I don't want everything if it means living without the person who makes me feel alive." Eleanor's voice sharpened with alarm. "Daniel, you're speaking emotionally. You need to think clearly about what you're saying." "I've never thought more clearly in my life." Daniel turned back to his mother, his expression calm but utterly determined. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to submit my resignation to the board of directors. I'm going to liquidate my personal assets, sell my shares in the company back to the family trust, and walk away from all of it." Eleanor staggered as if he'd physically struck her. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. And then I'm going to find Grace, wherever she's gone, and I'm going to ask her to marry me." "Daniel, you're not thinking rationally. You can't throw away $1 billion inheritance for a servant girl. Watch me." The simple certainty in his voice sent panic flooding through Eleanor. She'd expected anger, defiance, perhaps a few days of sulking before Daniel came to his senses. She hadn't expected this calm, methodical destruction of everything she'd worked to preserve. "You think you love her now," Eleanor said desperately. "But what happens when the money runs out? What happens when you're struggling to make ends meet, and you remember what it was like to have everything? Then I'll know what it feels like to work for something that matters to me instead of just inheriting something I never earned." Eleanor played her final card. "And what about Grace? Do you really think she'll be happy knowing you gave up everything for her? Do you think she'll be able to live with that guilt?" For the first time, Daniel hesitated. Eleanor pressed her advantage. She'll spend the rest of her life wondering if you regret your choice. Every time money is tight, every time you face a problem that wealth could have solved, she'll blame herself for your sacrifice. Is that the life you want for her? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering his mother's words. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful but unwavering. Grace taught me something about love that I'd never understood before. She taught me that real love isn't about what someone can give you. It's about who you become when you're with them. Pretty words, but they don't pay bills. No, they don't. But they also don't require bills to exist. Daniel moved closer to his mother. When I'm with Grace, I'm the best version of myself. I'm kinder, more thoughtful, more aware of how my actions affect other people. She makes me want to use whatever advantages I have to help others instead of just accumulating more advantages. That's naive idealism. That's purpose, Daniel interrupted. That's what it feels like to have a reason to get up in the morning beyond managing investments and attending social functions. Eleanor studied her son's face, seeing a resolve that frightened her more than his anger had. If you do this, there's no coming back. I won't be able to protect you from the consequences. I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking for understanding. I can't understand throwing away everything your family has built. And I can't understand choosing money over love, Daniel replied sadly. I guess that's where we differ. Eleanor felt tears pricking her eyes, though whether they were from frustration, fear, or grief, she couldn't say. Daniel, please, think about what you're doing. Think about your future. I am thinking about my future. I'm thinking about the kind of man I want to be, the kind of life I want to live, the kind of legacy I want to leave behind. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Mother, I know this isn't what you planned for me, but your plans never included my happiness, only my success. And I've learned that success without happiness is just a very expensive form of misery. You don't know what you're talking about. You've never been without money. You have no idea how difficult life can be when you can't afford what you need. Then I'll learn. Grace can teach me, the same way she's taught me to dance, to see beauty in simple things, to value authenticity over appearances. Eleanor felt control slipping away from her like water through her fingers. What if I apologize to her? What if I ask her to stay? It's too late for that, Daniel said quietly. You showed Grace exactly what you think of her. You threatened to have her arrested for crimes she didn't commit. You made it clear that you see her as beneath contempt. An apology now would just be strategy, not sincerity. Then what do you want from me? Daniel looked at his mother for a long moment, seeing fear and desperation in her eyes for the first time in his life. I want you to understand that love isn't a weakness to be controlled or eliminated. I want you to understand that the qualities you despise in Grace, her kindness, her humility, her willingness to sacrifice for others, are exactly the qualities that make her extraordinary. And if I can't understand that, then you'll lose your son along with everything else. Eleanor sank into one of the conservatory's wicker chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 62 years. I was trying to protect you. From what? From making the same mistake your father made. Daniel froze. What mistake? Eleanor was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Your father wasn't born to wealth, Daniel. He was the son of a mechanic from Ohio. When he arrived at Harvard on scholarship, he was brilliant but completely out of place among the wealthy students. Daniel stared at his mother, having never heard this story before. What happened? I fell in love with him. Completely, desperately, against my parents' wishes and all social convention. He was everything they said was wrong, poor, common, inappropriate for a girl of my background. But you married him. I did. Against every objection, every threat, every dire prediction about our future. I chose love over security, passion over practicality. And Eleanor's smile was bitter. And we were happy. For about 2 years, we were gloriously, completely happy. He was kind and funny, and he saw the world in ways that amazed me. But then real life started to intrude. Daniel sat down across from his mother, sensing that he was finally about to understand something fundamental about his family. The money started to matter, Eleanor continued. Not having enough for the things we wanted, watching other couples enjoy luxuries we couldn't afford, seeing him struggle to provide for me in the way he thought I deserved. It changed him. How? He became obsessed with accumulating wealth. Every decision, every friendship, every opportunity was evaluated based on its potential to increase our financial standing. The man I'd fallen in love with disappeared, replaced by someone who saw everything, including me, as assets to be leveraged. Daniel felt pieces of his understanding shifting into place. Is that why he was so focused on business? Why he never seemed to have time for anything else? He was trying to prove that he belonged in my world. But in the process, he lost everything that had made him special in the first place. Eleanor looked up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. By the time he died, I couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at me with love instead of calculation. Mother, I had no idea. I watched money destroy the man I loved, Daniel. I watched it turn him into someone I barely recognized. And when I see you with Grace, I see the same pattern starting all over again. It's not the same pattern, Daniel said gently. Grace isn't asking me to prove I belong in her world. She's not asking me to change who I am to deserve her love. But you're talking about giving up everything. I'm talking about choosing what matters most. There's a difference. Eleanor studied her son's face, seeing something there that reminded her of the young man she'd fallen in love with 40 years ago. What if you're wrong? What if giving up your inheritance doesn't lead to happiness? Then I'll deal with the consequences, Daniel said simply. But at least I'll know I tried to build something real instead of just maintaining something inherited. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, lost in memories of choices made and roads not taken. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, more uncertain. Where will you go? What will you do? I don't know yet. I'll figure it out as I go. That's terrifying. Daniel smiled for the first time since Grace had left. Yes, it is. It's also exciting. Eleanor looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw something she'd been missing for years. He looked alive in a way he hadn't since childhood, animated by possibility rather than weighted down by obligation. You really love her, Eleanor said, and it wasn't a question. I really do. And you think she loves you? Not what you can provide for her, but actually you? I know she does. She proved it tonight by walking away to protect me. Eleanor considered this. That was noble of her. That was Grace. She always puts other people's needs before her own, even when it costs her everything she wants. Especially then. Eleanor stood up from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that had been her pride and joy for decades. I've spent so much time trying to control everything, trying to ensure the perfect outcome, that I forgot outcomes aren't always what matter most. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the process matters more than the result. Maybe who you become while you're building a life matters more than what you end up with. Daniel joined his mother at the window. Grace taught me that too. She said dancing isn't about getting to the end of the song perfectly. It's about how you move through the music while it's playing. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She sounds like a wise young woman. She is. She's also kind, funny, talented, and she makes me want to be better than I am. Those are good qualities in a partner. Daniel looked at his mother in surprise. Are you saying? I'm saying I may have been wrong about some things. Eleanor's voice was carefully controlled. I'm saying that perhaps I let my own fears overshadow my judgment. Mother, where did she go? Grace? Do you know where she went? Daniel's heart began to race. I think so. She probably went home to pack, then to her mother's house. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. And her mother lives where? About 20 minutes from here, in town. Eleanor turned to face her son directly. Then we should probably go find her before she does something drastic, like leaving the state. Daniel stared at his mother, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Well, I can hardly expect you to convince her to come back after the things I said to her. An apology from me might be more persuasive. You would do that?" Eleanor's smile was rueful. "Daniel, I've made many mistakes in my life, but losing my son would be the biggest one. If Grace is the woman you love, then I need to find a way to accept her. And if I was wrong about her character—" Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. "Then I owe her a very sincere apology." Daniel felt hope flooding through him for the first time since Grace had walked out of the conservatory. "Do you mean that?" "I mean that I love you more than I love my pride," Eleanor said simply. "And if I have to choose between my prejudices and my son's happiness, I choose my son." 20 minutes later, Daniel and Eleanor stood on the front porch of a small, neat house in town, Daniel's heart hammering as he rang the doorbell. They'd stopped at Grace's room first, but found it empty except for a note saying she'd gone home to her mother. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s who looked like an older version of Grace. Her kind eyes were red-rimmed with tears, and she held herself carefully, as if movement caused pain. "Can I help you?" Grace's mother asked. Then her eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my goodness, you're Daniel Prescott." "Yes, ma'am. This is my mother, Eleanor Prescott. We're looking for Grace." "Is she here?" Grace's mother, introduced herself as Helen Mitchell, looked between them uncertainly. "She's here, but she's very upset. She came home about an hour ago, crying and saying she'd lost her job and everything was ruined." "Mrs. Mitchell," Eleanor stepped forward. "I'm afraid I'm responsible for Grace's distress. I said some very hurtful things to her tonight, and I'd like the opportunity to apologize." Helen studied Eleanor's face carefully. "Grace told me what happened. She said you threatened to have her arrested if she didn't leave your son alone." Eleanor flinched. "Yes, I did say that. It was inexcusable, and I deeply regret it. Why should I believe you're sincere now?" It was Daniel who answered. "Because I told my mother I was giving up my inheritance to be with Grace, and she realized that losing her son was worse than accepting his choice." Helen's eyebrows rose. "You're giving up your inheritance? If that's what it takes to be with Grace, yes." Helen looked at this wealthy young man standing on her modest porch, declaring his willingness to give up billions of dollars for love, and saw something that reminded her of herself at 26. "Grace," Helen called back into the house. "You have visitors." "I don't want to see anyone, Mom." Grace's voice came from somewhere inside, thick with tears. "I think you want to see these particular people," Helen replied, stepping aside to let Daniel and Eleanor into her small but immaculately clean living room. Grace appeared in the doorway wearing jeans and an old sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes swollen from crying. When she saw Daniel and Eleanor together, her face went white. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We came to apologize," Eleanor said before Daniel could speak, "and to ask you to come home." Grace stared at Eleanor in shock. "I don't understand." "I was wrong," Eleanor said simply. "About you, about your relationship with my son, about what matters most in life. I let my own fears and prejudices blind me to your character, and I treated you abominably." "Mrs. Prescott, please, let me finish." Eleanor moved closer to Grace. "I spent this evening talking with Daniel about love, about sacrifice, about what it means to choose someone over everything else. And I realized that everything I thought I knew about you was wrong. I don't follow." Daniel stepped forward. "Grace, I told my mother I was resigning from the company and giving up my inheritance to be with you." Grace's eyes widened in horror. "Daniel, no. You can't do that." "I can, and I will, if that's what it takes. But your family, your responsibilities. My responsibility is to my own happiness and to the woman I love," Daniel said firmly. "Everything else is just money and obligation." Grace turned to Eleanor, confusion clear on her face. "And you're all right with this?" Eleanor's smile was sad but genuine. I'm learning to be. Grace, may I tell you something about my marriage? I suppose. Eleanor sat down on Helen's worn but comfortable sofa, gesturing for Grace to join her. Reluctantly, Grace perched on the edge of a chair across from her. I married Daniel's father against my family's wishes, Eleanor began. He was poor, from a working-class background, completely inappropriate by society's standards. But I loved him desperately, and I thought love would be enough. Grace listened in surprise as Eleanor told the story of her young marriage, the happiness and the gradual dissolution as money became more important than connection. I've spent 30 years believing that love across class lines is doomed to fail, Eleanor concluded. But tonight, watching my son choose you over everything else, I realized something important. What? My husband and I failed not because we came from different worlds, but because we let those differences define us instead of building something new together. Eleanor leaned forward. Grace, you're not asking Daniel to prove he deserves you by accumulating wealth. You're not asking him to change who he is to fit into your world. Because I'm not asking him for anything, Grace said quietly. Exactly. And that's what I was too blind to see. Real love isn't about taking. It's about giving. And you've been giving Daniel something he's never had before, the chance to be loved for who he is rather than what he has. Grace felt tears starting again. Mrs. Prescott, I can't let Daniel give up everything for me. It's too much. The guilt would destroy us both. What if he didn't have to give up everything? Eleanor asked carefully. What do you mean? Eleanor looked at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. What if there was a way for Daniel to pursue his dream of doing meaningful work while still maintaining some connection to the family business? What if there was a compromise that honored both his desires and his responsibilities? I don't understand. Daniel sat down beside Grace, taking her hands in his. My mother is proposing that the family foundation fund the dance program we talked about. That I work to build something meaningful while still being part of the family legacy. Grace stared between them. You would do that? I would do that, Eleanor confirmed. If it means keeping my son in my life and gaining a daughter-in-law who makes him happy. Daughter-in-law. Daniel squeezed Grace's hands. Grace, will you marry me? The simple question hung in the air like a blessing. Grace looked at this man who was offering her everything she'd ever dreamed of, in a room that contained everyone she loved most in the world. Daniel, your world is so different from mine. Then we'll build a new world together, Daniel said simply. One that includes the best parts of both. Grace looked at Eleanor. And you would really accept me? As part of your family? Eleanor's eyes were bright with tears. Grace, I've spent this evening learning that family isn't about who shares your background. It's about who shares your values. And if you value my son's happiness enough to sacrifice your own for it, then you're exactly the kind of person I want in this family. Helen, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward. Grace, honey, what does your heart tell you? Grace looked around the room at the faces watching her with love and hope and acceptance, and felt the last of her fears melt away. My heart tells me that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones worth fighting for, Grace said softly. My heart tells me that love really can bridge any gap, if both people are willing to meet in the middle. So, Daniel asked, hope and anxiety warring in his expression. Grace smiled through her tears. So yes, Daniel Prescott, I'll marry you. The room erupted in joy as Daniel pulled Grace into his arms, spinning her around the small living room while Eleanor and Helen wiped away happy tears. When Grace asked breathlessly when Daniel finally set her down. As soon as possible, Daniel replied. I've wasted enough time not being married to you. Eleanor cleared her throat delicately. Actually, I was thinking the conservatory might make a beautiful wedding venue. If you'd like to be married at home. Grace stared at her future mother-in-law in amazement. You would want the wedding at the house. I would be honored to host the wedding at the house, Eleanor corrected. It seems appropriate, since that's where your love story began. 6 months later, the Prescott Conservatory was transformed into a fairy tale wedding venue. White roses and trailing ivy turned the glass room into a garden paradise, while soft string lights created the same magical atmosphere that had witnessed Grace and Daniel's first dance together. Grace walked down the aisle in a simple but elegant gown, her arm linked with Mrs. Patterson's, who had insisted on the honor of giving her away since Grace's father was absent. Daniel waited at the makeshift altar, looking handsome and nervous and completely besotted with his bride. The guest list was unlike anything society had ever seen, a mixture of wealthy socialites, business associates, household staff, and Grace's friends from town. For one afternoon, the rigid boundaries of class and status melted away in celebration of love that had conquered every obstacle. "We gather today," the minister began, "to celebrate the marriage of two people who have proven that love sees no boundaries, recognizes no barriers, and honors no divisions except those we create in our own hearts." Grace and Daniel exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not just to love and honor each other, but to build something meaningful together, to use their combined strengths to help others, and to never let fear or prejudice diminish the beauty of what they had found. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Grace as the assembled guests erupted in applause. But the most meaningful moment came when Eleanor stepped forward to embrace her new daughter-in-law. "Welcome to the family, Grace," Eleanor whispered. "I'm so grateful you found my son. I'm grateful you let me keep him," Grace whispered back. The reception that followed was a celebration that lasted well into the night. Grace and Daniel's first dance as husband and wife was performed to the same piece of music that had been playing the night they met in the conservatory, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room as they moved together with the perfect harmony that had defined their relationship from the beginning. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Grace found herself alone with Eleanor on the terrace overlooking the gardens. "Thank you," Grace said quietly. "For what?" "For changing your mind. For giving us a chance. For becoming the mother I always hoped to have someday." Eleanor smiled, and it was warm and genuine. "Grace, you gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing." "What's that?" "You gave me my son back. The real Daniel, not the dutiful heir I was trying to create, but the kind, passionate, purposeful man he was meant to be. He was always that man. He just needed permission to show it. And you gave him that permission by loving him exactly as he was." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Daniel say goodbye to the last of the guests, his face glowing with happiness. "What's next for you two?" Eleanor asked. "We're opening the dance studio next month. We've already got 20 students enrolled and 3 therapists interested in incorporating movement into their treatment programs. And personally," Grace's smile was radiant. "Personally, we're going to dance together every night for the rest of our lives. We're going to build a family that values love over legacy. And we're going to prove that the best foundations are built on choice rather than circumstance." 5 years later, Grace and Daniel stood in the same conservatory, now serving as the main studio for their thriving dance program. Around them, children from all backgrounds moved to music with joy and freedom, learning not just steps and techniques, but confidence and self-expression. Their 3-year-old daughter Emma played quietly in the corner, already showing signs of her mother's natural grace and her father's determined spirit. Baby Thomas slept peacefully in his carrier, oblivious to the beautiful chaos surrounding him. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked as she and Daniel watched their students prepare for their end-of-year recital. "Regret what?" "Giving up the life you could have had. The wealth, the status, the easy path." Daniel pulled his wife close, kissing the top of her head. "Grace, I didn't give up anything. I traded a life I inherited for a life I chose. I traded obligation for purpose. I traded loneliness for love. Even when money is tight. Even when we have to worry about the studio's budget or fix our own car instead of buying a new one. Especially then, Daniel said firmly. Because those challenges are ours to face together. They're part of the life we're building, not obstacles preventing us from living. Grace looked around the room at the faces of their students. Children who had found confidence through dance, adults who had discovered joy in movement, elderly participants who had regained flexibility and purpose through their programs. We did it, she said softly. We actually built something beautiful. We're still building it, Daniel corrected. Every day, every choice, every dance. That evening, after the students had gone home and the studio was quiet, Grace and Daniel shared their nightly dance in the same space where their love had first bloomed. The mirrors reflected their movements back to them, showing two people who had grown and changed and deepened their connection over the years they'd been together. What are you thinking about? Daniel asked as they swayed together to soft music. I'm thinking about visibility, Grace replied. About how I spent so many years trying to be invisible, thinking that was the only way to survive. And now I know that being seen, really seen and loved for who you are, is worth any risk. It's worth fighting for, worth changing your whole life for, worth believing in even when everyone tells you it's impossible. Daniel spun her gently, the same move she'd taught him on their first night together. And I'm thinking about choice. About how easy it is to live the life other people plan for you, and how much courage it takes to choose your own path. No regrets. Only one. Daniel said, pulling her close again. What's that? I regret that it took me 32 years to find you. I regret all the time we could have had together if I'd been brave enough to see you sooner. Grace smiled, the same radiant smile that had captivated Daniel from their very first dance. Maybe we needed those years to become the people who were ready for this love. Maybe we did. As they danced together in the conservatory, surrounded by mirrors and moonlight, Grace and Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them from invisible maid and reluctant heir to partners in love and life and meaningful work. Their story had become a legend in their community. Proof that love could indeed conquer all obstacles when two people were brave enough to choose each other over security, over expectations, over the easy path that led nowhere meaningful. Grace had learned that she didn't have to be invisible to be safe. Daniel had learned that he didn't have to accept a life that felt empty just because it looked successful from the outside. Together, they had built something beautiful and lasting and real. And every night, they danced together in the conservatory where it all began, celebrating not just their love but the courage it had taken to claim it, and the joy that came from choosing authenticity over appearance, connection over status, and love over everything else that pretended to matter more. If this story reminded you that love sees no boundaries, and that sometimes the most invisible people possess the power to transform everything around them, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Subscribe to Unique Love Stories for more incredible tales that prove love always finds a way. And remember that the most beautiful transformations often begin with the courage to be seen exactly as you are. Don't forget to share, like, and tell me in the comments. Which part interests you most? Which city were you listening from? And lastly, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the next story.